Yep.
And that will just open up the whole cooler. There will be some water here, of course.
Yep.
And so basically the biggest thing is just these pads will last you 5, 10, 15 years.
They will. Okay.
As long as you don't see where they're basically starting to separate or all come apart, or if they're starting to separate there, that's basically the easiest way to tell if they're starting to not work as well as if they start to separate.
Gotcha.
Little stuff like this, not a big deal.
Right.
Like I said, if you start to get some stuff built up on the outside, not a huge deal. Like I was telling him, the biggest thing about getting a bunch of stuff built up on the outside, the more you get built up on the outside, the higher the humidity gets. So it'll get super stuffy, humid. If there's a bunch of cottonwood built up on the outside
So
of
if
the
we
pads.
feel a lot of humidity inside
It's
the
all because
building,
the
then
pads
we need
are-
to come out and look at this.
I think I was telling him, you can hose off the outsides of those pads and get the cottonwood off when it's just sitting there. It must have satisfied because that's nothing that we did to turn this off.
Oh yeah. Okay.
So what I always recommend when you're going to shut it off is basically just to turn the power off, and it's just a matter of just moving that up.
To the old.
Yeah, and that's just that way this can't come on at all when it's covered. So that way if someone decides to push the buttons inside, nothing will happen inside and ruin the motor because the motor is the most expensive part.
Right.
The easiest way to tell if you're not having any power is there's little LEDs flashing inside there. If there's no LEDs, which I can move so you guys can see them
I see it. Yep.
inside there, as long as there's no LEDs, you know you got no power. And then when you turn the power on, you want to make sure you're seeing the LEDs.
Yeah.
And those LEDs do give you a diagnostic. If something is wrong, they will tell you this is what is wrong and what's not doing things right. That's what those LEDs are for. But as far as the system itself, the debris and stuff, and just keeping that cleaned out, it's not that bad.
Tray in the bottom.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And the pump has its own inlet mesh filter to keep anything from really getting into it.
So that probably needs cleaning out periodically.
Just to double check it. As long as it's sealed up, it shouldn't really need it.
Go right in there.
Yeah.
Carol, I'm getting
Yep.
shoulder.
Yep.
So the other thing that's really important on these coolers is right over here in this corner. This is your water sensor, and it actually tests basically the conductivity or the cleanliness of the water. And after it sees the water starting to get dirty or not very clean, that's what actually tells the system to drain itself out and clean itself out. So this just unclips and just pulls right off, and it's just these two probes basically talking to each other. So whenever we clean them or winterize them, we either take like a Scotch-Brite pad or something that's not too abrasive, but if there's ever calcium buildup on there, just get those back to being clean. They could be scratched or whatever, like if you have to use a knife, whatever you have to. But
Yeah.
looks like the water's pretty clean here, so it's not too bad, and I don't see a lot of calcium buildup in the water. At least I don't know how long it's been running. Maybe this is the first year for it.
Yeah, it is the first
Okay.
year.
So just keeping those clean, and usually we do that at the shutdown time, but as long as you do it at the shutdown or the startup, just to make sure they're clean. And that just clips and just pushes right back down and out. To where after it runs for so many hours, or if it starts to see the water's getting dirty, what it does is it closes this solenoid, which feeds the water to the cooler. It'll close that, and then it opens up this drain right here, and then it drains this water out. And that's just to keep you from having stagnant water inside the cooler, where you don't get that nasty, weird, stagnant smell.
So we've got a fairly
Basically,
decent.
when Excel looks at this, this is the one that gets the most efficiency and rebates and stuff like that because they're a high efficiency. It's the pads, the thickness of the pads and how well they evaporate the water, the self-cleaning system, and then you've got the direct drive variable speed blower. This blower will actually, if you start to get dirty, this motor will amp itself up and down to give you the most efficiency.
I've heard
That
it do
way
that.
it's running the best efficiency that it can. And if it gets to be where these are so clogged, that motor will actually go into a safety mode and will only go into low. It will never blow anything above low. And that's how we know the pads are basically a blanket.
Yeah.
And would you also see that it's not cooling as efficient?
It wouldn't work very well at all.
Okay,
And it'd be
great.
super humid. You walk inside and it'd be muggy like Texas, and it'd be really bad. It's really obvious when they're clogged. It's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
So the other big thing is when we're winterizing them, this is our solenoid valve and our float. This float is basically just a foam pad that basically just tells it when the water level is high enough, it shuts off. But when we winterize them, what you want to do is you want to unscrew the water from here, after we shut off of the faucet, of course. So I can actually do it. It's not going to hurt anything. We just unscrew this. And it's just plastic, so it really shouldn't take unless you need to put a wrench. But we always want to make sure that rubber washer's in there.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And then there's just these 2 wires on the back of the solenoid valve. And they just pull right off. So you just disconnect that right there. And then this thing just unscrews.
So we do that when we shut down.
When you winterize it, yeah, this is the one part that if water sits inside this, the body of this will crack. And then, so that's basically your
So
solenoid
that's
right
your
there.
drain, right?
Right.
As well.
So your drain's right here.
Gotcha.
That has the drain
That's
coming off
the
of it.
point of it.
This is your solenoid valve. So this is the one that we usually take off and just set inside. You can take this one off too if you want to, depending on if you're worried about it walking away or whatever. But we always want to make sure we have a gasket there. And then there's a rubber gasket on the inlet side right here. And it's just a hose gasket. So if it ever does get lost, it's just a normal hose.
Good.
When you guys are putting this back on, the only thing to look at is there is an arrow on here. The arrow needs to point towards the swamp cooler.
Okay.
Arrow points up.
Just like it is right there. And these 2 wires, they are color coded, but it actually doesn't matter. They can go either way. Blue, brown doesn't matter. It's just a solenoid. It's just opening and closing. So these wires are not denominational on the terminals, so it doesn't matter where that goes. So basically, when you want to turn it on, so just kind of be the reverse. Like I said, most of this stuff is plastic, so you really don't got to go crazy with wrenches unless it's
Better not.
leaking.
Yeah.
If it's leaking, you can definitely put a wrench on it. But as long as that thing's leaking, there's no reason to go crazy. And then it's just a matter of
Easy freezer.
oh, and like I was telling him too, when you disconnect this for the winter time, you're gonna want to turn the hose bib off and then unscrew this. You don't want to leave that on because what the problem with that is this is an anti-freeze faucet, which means it shuts off way inside the building, but this is left on, it'll actually crack that faucet. It'll freeze if that's left on.
Yeah.
When you disconnect this and you disconnect that, just blow through it and it'll get the water out of it.
Okay.
Sometimes we have to use a compressor or like something like a, but since it's this long, just blowing through it's all you gotta do. Right here, because it'll freeze and then it'll break that line.
You have to open. Do you know?
On this one, I don't think you have a.
Oh, there, you know, there is. It's,
Is it
what
something?
you're thinking, it's where that thing slides up. There's a square
Oh,
of
that
rigid
little
foam.
door right there?
Yeah.
Right
And I
by your left hand.
Yes, that,
Oh,
I
here.
lifted
Yeah.
that up.
So that's
The-
the winterization panel.
Yeah.
And I took that foam pad out and put it next to the furnace.
Okay.
Yeah, good point too.
Because
That-
otherwise,
that does
it's
what you
just
said.
literally cold air going into the
Well, and that's
Yeah.
kind of what the cover does too.
Oh, good point.
The
yeah.
cover will kind of serve as that same purpose when it's covered in the wintertime. And then plus it keeps anything from coming into this.
Are those holes problematic or? it
They're
doesn't-
not. I mean, they're cooling outside, but it's not like it's really an issue.
Oh, we need the cooler.
Yeah, we'll just stand right there.
So I might put some duct tape on it.
Yeah, something like that would.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've actually got some metal tape.
Well, that's even better.
Yeah, large. At what point do you recommend shutting this down? Is it a temperature? Is it a?
So it's basically when we start to get freezing overnight for a few nights in a row.
Got it. Okay.
Now, if we wanted to, because it depends on how much the building's using the cooling like that, because we do have those times where it's cold at night and then it's still 80 to 90 degrees during
Yeah.
the day. If we're ever worried about that, what you can do is just shut off the water here and then get the pressure off of it. And then there is a drain button on the control itself that says drain.
Yeah.
And it'll empty this out and drain all the water out of the cooler. That'll last you a few nights without having to fully take down the whole system.
Got it.
That way, if also you have a warm day, you can just turn the water back on, turn the unit back on, and it's still fully working.
And that drain button is on the.
It's on the
inside.
control.
Yeah,
Yep.
and it does say, it says manual drain.
Okay, yeah, I did see
And the
that.
cooler will not restart or do anything until you actually physically go in there and say cool again.
Yeah.
So once you manual drain, it shuts itself off until it's been told to come back on.
Okay.
Is when it says water sensor not sensing water. That means someone has tried to cool with the unit and the water's not turned on to it.
Got it.
Very common problem that we have. Especially when they're hooked up to a hose faucet, it's people shut off the hose.
Right.
Then they go to run their cooler and it says no water and they're kind of worried and it's just like,
Yeah.
where's your water on your unit? And that's one of the biggest things that we get called for is just water not being on the unit.
Okay, great.
Besides that, it's really hot outside, and the cooler's just super loud inside because it's trying to make up for stuff. If you go into fan mode, you can actually decide what speed it is. That way,
Yes.
it's not too loud that we have to talk over the cooler.
Oh.
It'll still cool, but it'll just stay in that speed the whole time. That way, it's not so loud. We have a lot of people that
It'll be variable.
when they start entertaining at their house, there's a lot of heat demand, and the cooler's on full blast, and they can't even hear themselves
Sure.
talk.
Sure.
So that's where we get rid of the thermostat mode, go into fan mode, and that way you can just run it at one speed, and it's still cool, but it's not so loud. You start to
Yeah,
get calcium buildup on this because this is actually the water distribution system throughout all the pads. You can just take that same Scotch Brite we were talking about cleaning this with, and you can just clean that calcium right off. It's not going to hurt anything. It's not going to matter.
And that's up.
These trays right here. It's basically this is a
Oh, yeah.
water trough that just
Yeah,
spreads, and it's the
gotcha.
same on all four sides. If you just start to see a buildup on there, you can just clean that right off.
And you
Same
can
within
pull-
here. If you see anything get built up in here, you can just literally clean that right off. It's not going to hurt anything.
And you can pull each side like you did this front one.
They're all the same hump. That's otherwise they all look like that. Holes in their cabinets, and they warranted them all out. They guaranteed there'd be no holes, and then we sent a picture of
Yeah.
these giant holes in their coolers, and they took care of it.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. Oh, and then the other thing is too is sometimes when I start them up, depending on how they look on the inside, I like to use what's called green clean. It's just like kind of like a
Oh, yeah, yeah,
homeopathic,
yeah,
like, green
yeah.
clean.
Yep,
And
yep.
I just put it in the water, and it'll actually, as it runs, it'll go through all these, and it'll clean everything out. Doesn't hurt anything. Doesn't really smell.
Yeah.
And I usually run a good amount of it through every cooler that I start up. That way, as it runs through the season, it just kind of cleans itself as it operates.
Would you say you'd do that at the beginning of every season?
Yeah.
Beginning of
As
the
you started
season,
up. Yeah.
And that's a product called Green.
Green
called
clean.
Green
Yeah.
Clean,
We
yeah.
have actually some in the kitchen.
And it's just more of a, it's like a condensed or like a concentrated.
It's like a
evaporative.
eco-friendly Mr. Clean.
Yeah, it's something you don't have to worry about breathing is
Yeah.
the big thing.
Yeah.
Smelling or breathing. We do have some people that run vinegar through it, but vinegar's a very strong smell.
Yeah, it
Right
does.
here. They need to make sure they're going inside those little holes. On that corner, it's up above, so it's not letting it sit flush. So
Okay.
just when I put it back, whenever I always put them back, I kind of lean it back, and I make sure that the bottom's all sitting in the trough like it should. And then you can just kind of feel them where they go in. You just gotta kind of, yep. And as long as they all sat, then we should be pretty tight on the seam. So
Yeah,
that's why I
it
think that
is.
one's out. That's why I'm gonna get it.
Yeah, it is definitely
Just that little
sticking up.
bit.
Yep.
That's where basically you just come here and
Ah,
that's it. But all that little stuff
Yep.
doesn't really hurt too much. But like I said, I'll get you guys a price on those